Esther, the events that are recorded in the book of Esther actually occur between Ezra and Nehemiah. But they're placed in our Bible after Ezra and Nehemiah because originally Ezra and Nehemiah were one book. They were connected. Specifically, all of the events that we read in the book of Esther transpire within a 60-year period between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. There is a gap in the book of Ezra between 6 and 7, chapter 6 and chapter 7. There's a 60-year gap. And the book of Esther occurs in that 60-year gap. King Cyrus gave a decree in 538 BC for all of the captured peoples of his empire to return to their homeland. It was not just for the Jews, but it was for all captured peoples to return to their homeland. And a portion of the exiled Jews returned from their captivity to Jerusalem under a man named Zerubbabel in the year 536 BC, or about 20 years later. Certainly by 516 BC, those returning Jews had finished their temple construction projects, and they had begun to set worship back into the temple, but the worship needed correction. And so by 458 BC, some 80 years later, Ezra would return with a second group of Jewish return exiles to begin to set things right. And he would teach the nation of Israel statutes and judgments, and that's recorded in Ezra chapter 7. But had it not been for the events that we read in the book of Esther that occur between 483 and 4... But we'll get to all of that in time. Read with me, if you will, this first section of the book of Esther, starting at chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, that in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the province being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. When these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed a royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zathar, and Kerkais, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus, the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, or with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment, and the next to him was Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? Then Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. You've probably heard the phrase that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I wish at this point I could play for you the Imperial March from the Star Wars series. Now, I certainly have not kept up with all 298,000 episodes of that series. I've only seen the first 3 from when I was a young child, about Corbin's age. But if I could play for you the Imperial March at this point in time, I'm sure the sounds would invoke feelings of power. But it would be dark power, wouldn't it? The mysterious power that would be misused. It would be abused. It would be a polluted power. It would be a corrupt power. And it would immediately begin to conjure in your minds the feelings of an imminent overthrow. All feelings which in chapter 1 of the book of Esther, King Ahasuerus should be feeling. Now, today, we've introduced 16 different characters. We've not met the main character of this book. But we're going to focus primarily on this corrupt overlord. And so I'll title this sermon for this chapter, The Empire Strikes Back. Because that's what's happening here. We're seeing the entire force of the empire striking out on one person who dares stand up to the power of the empire. And I want you to see, first of all, the arrogance of this king. Verses 1 through 4 are designed to introduce us to the arrogance of this king. We see in the very first verse his provinces. The provinces, 127 of them, the word here in the Hebrew is satrapy, or it's an accounting that would include subdivisions and smaller government bodies, and it's all done to enlarge it, to make the number look bigger. All of his histories, including Daniel, including the other biblical references, only give us an account of somewhere around 60 satraps that King Ahasuerus had. So where does this number 127 come from? It's an exaggeration. Now, certainly he does have 127 governors and provinces, but what it is he's not just, he's counting smaller subdivisions. It's like he's not just counting the states, he's counting the counties and the cities and every little small subdivision he can get. He's trying to inflate the numbers. So certainly he has 127 rulers and 127 different political subdivisions. From the very opening sentence here of this book, we see the opulence and the aggrandizement of this man and his materiel. So each of these provinces sends their nobles, they send their princes, they're sending their leading families to this huge feast that is made for the king. Actually, we'll see in a few minutes that this is a war conference. These nobles are gathered from across the entire empire. From the Indus River, which used to be India, it is now Pakistan, all the way to what the text says is Kush, which is translated appropriately Ethiopia. It's here to the African continent, and so this man has all of the Eastern Empire. He actually controls the majority of the entire known world. Shushan here. We know this from other biblical texts as Susa, the palace. It's located in the southwestern region of modern-day Iran. This is the winter palace of the Persian king. It's one of 4 of his capital cities. This is the same place from which Daniel has proclaimed his many visions to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. It is the same place which in a few years Nehemiah would perform as the king's cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. So we're familiar with these provinces. The period which our author here records for us as the 3rd year of his reign, we know from history, is 483 BC. There's no mistaking when this is. Ahasuerus ruled as the king of Persia from the year 486 to the year 465 BC. Ahasuerus was his Hebrew name. If you cross-reference Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, and Daniel chapter 9, verses 1, you'll see him by his Greek name. King Ahasuerus is also known as King Xerxes. His Persian name is even more difficult to say. I'll probably butcher it. Kishayarshasan. This will be the last time you hear me say his Persian name. Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, the same guy, whether you talk in Greek or whether you talk in Hebrew, Xerxes has come to power in 486 BC. So the 3rd year of his reign here is 483. This matches perfectly the timeline of the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote the Histories. Histories includes the many exploits of the Persian kings. It includes all of their conflicts. Herodotus, however, writes from the Greek perspective. I will just note for you that it is the winners that write the histories. So understand that King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus here, is a new ruler of a large empire, and he has a score to settle. He has a score to settle with the Greeks, and it's the Greeks that are writing the histories. Now we come to the next. We see his reign, we see his provinces, we see the period, and now I want you to look at his parties. Oh my. There's too many to list. Verses 3 through 9, we're introduced to a theme in the book of Esther, which is parties. The word here is banquets or feasts. It comes from the Hebrew word that means to drink. There's 3 parties mentioned here in the very first chapter. If you look through the book, depending upon how you count, there are 10 different parties. Feasts, parties, are a theme in the book of Esther. It's one way that you can study through this text. This is the first party, the first banquet. The first word here in our text is the word feast. Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, had a father, a man that you're familiar with if you remember our series from Daniel. His name was Darius. Daddy Darius invaded Greece in an attempt to subjugate the Greek city-states. Darius had a particular hatred for one city-state, the city of Athens. He hated Athens. He wanted to do anything and everything he could, spend any amount of money, sacrifice any amount of his subjects so that he could defeat Athens. Persian invasion of Athens was repelled when Darius was defeated, and defeated soundly, I might add, in a battle in 490 BC. I'm skipping over a lot of history here, I know, for those of you that are history buffs. 490 BC, the Persian invasion was repelled by the Athenians at a place that you may be familiar with. It was a place called Marathon. When the Greeks repelled the attack of the Persians in the marshes of Marathon, the Persian navy then set back and they sailed around the cape and they decided to attack Athens directly. The Athenian warriors knew of their tactics, and so they returned from Marathon to Athens at a very, very quick pace so that they could defend their city. The distance that they covered from the marshes of Marathon to return to their city of Athens was, you might know this. 26 miles, 385 yards, the distance from which we get our modern marathon run. And that battle was the tide that turned the great civilized powers from Eastern civilization to Western civilization. Darius, the king, returned home to lick his wounds and to plan a better tactic. He was going to plan a second invasion with more men, more materiel, and a greater, larger army. However, that second invasion didn't materialize because 4 years later he would die in the year 486 BC. Hence, Ahasuerus, his son, would rise to the throne. We know this man as Xerxes, King Ahasuerus. So what we read here in Esther in verses 3 and 4, what is actually occurring, if you see there, he has this feast, and this feast lasted 180 days. That's 180 days. It's 6 months. It's 6 months of a feast. We're pretty clear on what happened here. This was the war conference of Xerxes. And this fits with the histories as well. What's happening here is Xerxes is parading all of the nobility through his wintertime palace. He is parading all of these princes and all of these leaders of all of the different regions through his palace so that he can show them his vast resources. What he wants to do is to encourage them, or could we use the word enforce, his empire. He wants to force them to conscript troops. He wants to force them to raise taxes. He wants to force them to bring tools for this coming second invasion of Greece, which he will now perform. Let me read to you what Herodotus says about Xerxes. He quotes Xerxes as saying, "I will reduce the whole earth into one empire." He says this, quoting Xerxes again, "My intent is to throw a bridge over the Hellespont and march an army through Europe against Greece, that thereby I may obtain vengeance from the Athenians for wrongs that are committed by them against the Persians and against my father." So what Xerxes plans to do is he plans to attack Greece. He plans to go after the Greek city-state of Athens because he wants to avenge his father's grudge. Now, have we ever seen a son start a war because of his father's hatred? I don't know. Did we find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? I know. I'm sure some were there, and I'm sure some of them were probably carried off into Syria. But, you know, if I remember my history right, I think Saddam Hussein threatened Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. was upset about it, right? I digress. You know the rest of the story. Ukraine, I know. We're interested in battling communism, right? But the political party that's interested in battling communism over there is marching communism through our country as fast as they can employ it, right? We're supposed to forget that his son has millions and millions of dollars of energy contracts. I know, I digress. I just want to tell you the rest of the story so that you know the whole story. Ahasuerus does invade Greece. He invades Greece in the year 480 BC, which is 3 years after this war conference, okay? 3 years after this 6-month-long war conference, Ahasuerus does invade Greece. And he gets soundly stomped. I mean, he gets routed. Just like Daddy Darius. I'll tell you how crazy this guy is. The naval defeat was at a place called Salamis. The army defeat was at Plataea It happened in 479 BC. The arrogant king stayed on his royal litter and watched while all of his subjects were defeated. That's how arrogant this guy is. We need to move on, or I'm never going to get done. Verses 5 through 12. When the days were expired of this feast, verses 5 through 12, we see this king is influenced greatly by alcohol. Alcohol makes us do some really, really strange things. Now he starts into what is a demonstration. Okay? So we've moved away from arrogance, and now we've gotten into alcohol. First of all is a demonstration. Verse 5 through 7 is the second party. The days were expired. The king made a feast unto all the people. So what just happens? We see a demonstration going on here. The first party is finished. The first 180-day party is finished. So what do you do when you finish that party? Let's have another party. I mean, the 6-month party is done, so let's have a party that the party's over. Let's celebrate. I mean, I didn't make that up. I mean, that's you ever known alcoholics that, hey, the party's over, let's have another party? So as soon as the 180-day, the 6-month party is over, they have another week-long party. It says here it's a 7-day feast. There's a bunch of party animals. But this feast, it says in verse 5, is unto all the people that were in Shushan, the palace. So it includes not only the military minds that he's been bringing through on a circuit, on a rotation for the first 6 months, but now it includes all of his subjugated servants as well. Maybe this feast is to show their unity. Maybe it's a reward to be to reward their diligence in the task of serving all of these military minds for 6 months. We don't know exactly, but we do know that it has the purpose of continuing his arrogant display of wealth. How do we know this? Well, because this one is, if you read it, it is at the court of the palace. I mean, come and see all these fine cotton linens. Come look at all these various colors that he has. It's all to symbolize royalty. It's all about his wealth. The woven cords, the hanging curtains, the linen, the silver rings, the marble pillars. Notice here it's beds of gold and silver. And the word here for beds is the Hebrew word that we would use for couches. It's not literally a bed that you sleep on. It's a couch that you would repose upon. Marble pavement. This marble pavement is a mosaic of multiple colors. Verse number 7, each man has his own cup. They gave them drink in vessels of gold, vessels being diverse, different from one another. Every person had their own cup. So they didn't get out their Sharpie marker and write their name on their red Dixie cup like we do back here in the back, so they can keep them all separate. Everybody has their own cup that's different. This is a huge, huge festival, and no two cups are alike. Can you see the opulence and the wealth of this ruler? Royal wine. Persian kings were treated with special vintage. It's not the usual fare. Maybe that's one of the reasons they had cupbearers. You see the opulence in this second party? Now we read on down to verse number 9. Vashti the queen made a feast for the women. This is the third party. And party number 2 and party number 3 are concurrent. They're occurring at the same time. This one is inside the palace. Party number 2 is going on outside. It's in the court of the garden. Party number 3 is ladies only, and it's inside. What's happening here and what that purpose is, we're not told. But we know this. It's a culture of celebration. It's a culture of revelry. It's big trouble. That's the demonstration. Now look at verse number 8. We'll see a decree going on. Persian kings have a law for everything. I mean, if you think your employer has a rule for everything, we got a rule for how to sharpen a pencil. We got a rule for how to use a stapler. We got a procedure. We got a procedure on procedures. We have a procedure on type of procedures. We have a procedure on how to make a procedure. Some of you guys are, we got a procedure on how to wear a mask. We got a procedure on when and where and how to breathe. Some of y'all know I'm serious because some of y'all worked at some of these places, right? This guy is one of those. He has a rule for everything. The law states this. Verse number 8. Drinking was according to the law, but none did compel. The law is everyone drinks, but only if you want to. Do we need a law that says breathe, but only if you want to? You have to drink, but only if you want to? You see, the normal law in the Persian Empire was that it was compulsory consumption. If the king puts out liquor, you got to have some. But this feast is different. It's just optional intoxication. Let me just say this, since we're building a picture of this guy's personality. When a king or a CEO or a pastor or a president, see here I'm going to get political again. When any of these rulers have to pass a law or pass a policy for every little tiny detail, you can take note that that is an insecure person. He's what I would call a teacup tyrant. Let's look at his display in verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded all of these fellows to bring Vashti the queen before him with a royal crown, but the queen refused in verse 12. Verse number 10, we see that the king is drunk. He's intoxicated. He's inebriated. Well, there's all kinds of words we can fill in here. Sin will make you stupid. Drinking will make you dumb. Ahasuerus is proud. He's boastful. We've seen that he's vindictive. And now he's just outright drunk. There's no sanity in this world anymore. Verse 11. The king here is in process. The whole purpose of this council is to make a display of everything. He has displayed his wealth. He's brought in all of these rulers to display his works. That's the point of the curtains and the robes and the rings and all of the pavement. He's shown off his wealth. He's shown off his works. And now he wants to show off his women. And there are none as beautiful as Queen Vashti. And while we're here, let me tell you that Vashti is probably not her name. It's probably not a proper name. Vashti is a title that's given to this queen. Vashti is a word that means the very best. And so it may not be her proper name. It's a word given to her that means the very best. In all likelihood, her actual name is Queen Amestris, who is the mother of Artaxerxes, whom Nehemiah frequently speaks about just a few years later. So what exactly is it that the king is saying when he says, bring to me Vashti, the queen? There's a number of interpretations here. Some of them are not polite to mention in public. Can I just leave it there? A number of interpretations that are possible, we just shouldn't talk about them. All of the various students of this text agree that the king's intention was to make a public display out of Vashti. His intentions are not respectable. All of the students agree with this. Whatever this request was, it was not only disrespectful, but it was unusual. It's like, why would he do that? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't even make sense. It's an unusual request even for a Persian king who was never supposed to be disobeyed. And so the connotation here is that this is not a normal, hey, go get the queen, I have a question to ask. Hey, go get the queen, tell her to come see me because I have a request for her. Something about this request was amiss. And so we don't know what the allusion was, that he had in mind, but they did. And they knew that whatever it was out of place. That was the display that he was trying to make out of her. Okay? And so we don't need to know about the other stuff. But now we see her decision in verse 12. What exactly is her response? What exactly did Queen Vashti respond? Well, the short version is no. She just said no. Now, I'm just going to be real honest with you as your preacher here. This is only the first time where we have some trouble with how to understand what the author of Esther is giving to us. And I'm going to tell you what, this is one of the easier ones. Because as we get into chapter 2 and chapter 5 and on into chapter 6, the questions that we leave unresolved are going to get tougher. The queen here says no. And let me tell you this. I have heard a number of preachers that have extolled the virtues of Queen Vashti for her refusal to satisfy her husband. Well, he was out of line for asking whatever it was that he was asking, and so she did the right thing by telling him no. But I can say this. By telling him no, she lost her influence in the empire. She became a banished woman. I can say that that particular view is very popular amongst feminist commentaries. There are feminists that take this particular book and reinterpret it for their cause. It's also the predominant view amongst the social justice commentaries. Yes, there are social justice warriors, part of the woke movement, that will take this book and reinterpret it for their particular cause. That's often the favorite interpretation of Baptist preachers. I've heard a number of other preachers say that Vashti got what she deserved because women are always supposed to be submissive to their husbands. Really? I would say to those that would be foisting a Judeo-Christian ethic upon a Gentile queen in an Eastern culture. And that would also ignore Colossians 3:18, which says, "Wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as it is fit in the Lord." And so here's just the first of many unresolved issues that we'll face in coming weeks. And so I'm going to leave this debate right where our author leaves it, which is unresolved. Something for you to ponder and think about. I believe the author's intent here is to show the volatility of the king. It's to record for us the providence of God in keeping the promises of God in the progress of our life. And so I think the best place, the wisest place to leave the judgment of Vashti is with the righteous judge who knows all, the righteous judge who sees all, the righteous judge who knows the heart and who looks upon the heart when all we can see is the outside. So we've seen his arrogance, we've seen his alcohol. Let's look in verse number 12 and see his anger. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Just a couple of things to point out here. You all are accustomed to your original language lesson, so here's your original language lesson for the morning. He was wroth. Wroth here is the word that means to be full of wrath, to be furious. We see here the word anger. Anger in the original means hot. It is a word that is used to express a hot displeasure or an indignation. And the word here for burned, it means to be kindled, to start a fire, to literally be consumed. So as we said, sin makes you stupid, drinking makes you dumb, alcohol will make you angry. In all of the years that I have known alcoholics, those with drinking problems, all of the years that I worked part-time in a police force, I've known very, very precious few happy drunks. Most of the time, alcohol makes you 10 foot tall and bulletproof. And so the point here is that this guy is not a crock pot. He's a lit fuse. And the fuse is a very short fuse. And it's already been lit and it's been stoked. So let's move on and look at his advisors. Verses 13 through 18, we see advisors. I'm going to ask you this to start. Do you recognize bad advice when you hear it? I hope you do. You really should. Advisors are the ones that should give you sound reasoning. They should be the gut check for you. They should be the ones that give you deep thoughts. They should promote a wise head, a cool head. Proverbs 29 verse 12 says, if a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. If a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. I used that in my secular employment a lot when I gave unpopular advice. Many times you find that bad counsel is often offered to intentionally take advantage of you. It reminds me of that Life commercial for cereal. I'm not going to try it. You try it. No, I'm not going to try it. You try it. Sometimes bad advice is given to get you in a trap. And by the way, we're going to see that in this chapter. We'll learn it again in a few chapters with a man named Haman. Verses 13 to 18, we see this king interact with his advisors. Verse number 12 and 13, you see the irony here. And I encourage you to read this whole book through. At least read ahead a few chapters so you'll know where we're going. The irony here is again, the first of many. Some have suggested that the story of Esther provided Jews remaining in their captivity here as a means to laugh. They were to find humor in the face of their captors. They were to find humor in the face of their possible annihilation. And that would very possibly be one theme for the book. Did you know that this book of Esther absolutely terrified the Nazis during World War II? They hated it. If you got caught with a copy, if you got caught reading Esther in World War II, it was an immediate death sentence. They knew the promises of God, worked through the providence of God, and if you were caught reading the book of Esther, you were killed. And you know what? They couldn't stop it. Because even in the Nazi concentration camps, so many Jewish persons had read this book and committed it to memory. They could take all of the books, they could destroy them and burn them, and they would get paper and pen. They just start writing it back out from memory. Couldn't get rid of it. When the 10 leaders of the Nazi regime were hung after the Nuremberg trials, several of them said, this is the second Purim for the Jews. They were terrified of this book. And here in these verses is one of the first of the many ironic humors in this historical narrative. The king here, should we do to the queen Vashti according to the law? You see what's happening here? The king says here, I've called the entire kingdom together so that these warriors will submit on the battlefield to my every command, but I can't get my wife to obey in my own house. Do you see the ironic humor here? Now, I'm not going to ask if that sounds familiar to any of you guys. I'm just going to point this out. As you read through this book, look for the irony. Look for the humor, because this book shows a sense of humor. I mean, this book is talking about annihilation of an entire ethnic group. But there's irony here. There's humor here. Look at the Inquisition in verse 13. My wife says no. So the king says to the wise men in verse 15, what should we do? Start the Inquisition. Call the royal advisors. What are we going to do? It's a national emergency. He has to call all 7 of his royal, trusted, closest advisors because somebody said no. Call the royal advisors. These 7 small tyrants here that are listed in verse 14, they're going to come back to play in the next chapter. These are the princes that have direct daily access to the king. I was tempted to call this chapter Xerxes and the 7 Dwarfs, but that was a title I read in one of my commentaries, but I didn't want to rip the title off totally. But that's what these guys act like. Look at the insolence. Verse 16. Mamukin, this bad advice from the advisors. Mamukin answers before the king and the princes, Vashti has not only done wrong to the king, but to all the princes. That's us 7, by the way. That's the 7 that are here talking. Done wrong to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. So they overlooked all the good advice, and now he's exaggerating these consequences. You see, a good advisor would have probably reminded the king that trimester carrying their future son Artaxerxes, she might not be feeling well right now. You see, Artaxerxes was also born this same year in 483 BC. This party's been going on for 6 months. Do the math. It's not difficult. Her beauty might not be display ready at this particular moment. Right? And we go back to what exactly was the king asking? And I said, we don't really need to know. Whatever it was not appropriate. And one of the good advisors might have said, hey, she's about 7 months along, 8 months along, maybe 9 months along. Cut her some slack. Right? But instead, we got this fella here that is probably trying to raise some support for himself. And so rather than giving some good advice, he exaggerates the potential consequences. Oh, king, it's much, much worse than you thought. She's not just insulted you. This is a grave injustice to all of us. Why? What interest do you have in it? Again, we're not going to let our minds go too far off into what it was he was asking. Verse 16, you see an interesting thing here done in the languages. She's not just insulted you, she's insulted all of the princes, and this is offensive to all of the people in all of the provinces, all the princes, all the people, all the provinces, 3 times. This is an exaggeration, and this exaggeration is included as an attempt to legitimize his ignorant advice. Now let's talk about the advice you give your boss, or the advice that some of your employees give you. You know, when there's an exaggeration, and the exaggerations just pile on top of other exaggerations, you pretty well know that, you know, if you're given advice and you have to blow it up and overstate it, there's a real good chance that it's not the right thing. When you have to overstate the obvious and exaggerate the facts, you need to watch the advice, don't you? And notice what he said. You're going to hear it everywhere. It's going to insult everybody in all the provinces. I mean, all the way from Pakistan to Middle Africa. It's a national crisis because the queen said no. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all the women. The women might hear about it. Where were they? Party number 3 was already going on in the palace, right? So her closest friends, her closest consort, well, they've already heard about it. So all you're doing is crowing about something that's already happened to the few little select ones that are already in the party. By the way, what's going on in there? The same thing that's going on out here in the court, right? They're probably not going to remember it tomorrow. Oh, we've already said it, right? Sin makes you stupid. Drinking makes you dumb, right? They're probably not going to remember tomorrow. They're probably not going to care by next week. The women might hear it. Well, the ones that are in the queen's banquet already heard about it. Verse 17. They might despise all their husbands when it shall be reported. Aha, there's the problem. It might be reported King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought before him, but she came not. So we're scared that other women throughout the realm will surely hear of this. Well, probably not if you quit making a big deal about it. Right? Remember when I told you to look for the ironic humor in this story? Yeah, that was a big... Being good advisors and stop trying to usurp the throne and being a peacock about everything, this will probably just blow over. I mean, when the king calls and says, what shall be done to Queen Vashti? You know what? She might not feel good today. She's getting ready to have a son. You might want to maybe give her a little extra support. Leave her alone. It'll blow over. But instead, call everybody. Let's broadcast this. I mean, when the president comes on TV, get all of the major networks, preempt everything. That's what's going to happen. It's going to be way too much wrath. Really? Why would that happen? Because we're going to call a press conference and we're going to send this out over the national broadcast. We're going to tell everybody. In fact, we're going to call the press conference right now. That's the next point. We've seen the arrogance, the alcohol, the anger, these bad advisors. Now let's look at his announcement. And this king just doesn't have enough sense to turn it off. The announcement, verse number 19. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, be not altered. Vashti, come no more before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal estate to another that is better than she. Did you catch that one? We'll talk about it in a minute. When the king's decree, which he shall make, be published throughout all his empire, for it's great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. The saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according. Give her estate to another. Estate here is the Hebrew word for royalty or power. Basically, it's everything she has. Give her office, give her possessions, give her servants, give everything that she has to someone else. And so this impulsive, wicked king is going to render his wife both divorced and desolate. And she is carrying the future king. She's still carrying. Vashti is indeed a mistress. Then the histories of Herodotus indicate. So here's the humor in this. Here's the irony. The king has banished her to go find someone better than she, who is named Vashti, which means the very best. Go find someone better than the very best. I love this book. That's the command. Here's the consent, verses 20 and 21. The purpose is all you wives now better do exactly what your husband says. If not, we're going to have a national crisis on our hands. More exaggeration, right? More humor. Because the queen said no one time in the palace, we now have a law that goes out everywhere. And we pass this law. Make it a law. Make it a law, and a law that shall never be revoked. Make it a law that shall never be disobeyed. And this is the law. All wives must honor their husband. It doesn't matter if he's a prince. It doesn't matter if he's a pauper. He is the monarch of his manor. And the insinuation is simply this. All women in all places must consent to all of the commands of their husband. In verse 22 is he has to bear rule in his own house. That's the rule. Don't any of you women ever say no to any of your men. That's it. And if you do, it's a national crisis. Here's thereof. The Persian and Median Empire had a system of communication that is probably easiest to, and each of these scribes would be called, and they would immediately translate this dispatch from their language into all of the different languages of the empire. They would then take these different letters, roll them up, put wax on them, and seal it with the king's signet ring. And then they would take each of these letters with fresh riders on fresh horses. That way, this law, this new directive would be dispersed out to the kingdom, distributed. It was to be further copied amongst all the people in all the places. Again, are you catching the irony here? By this missive, the king has now ensured that everyone will hear about the queen's disobedience. In other words, we're afraid that some of these ladies somewhere in the kingdom might hear about this. Well, let's ensure it. Let's write it down. Let's translate it into every language. Let's get it on horseback, and let's get it in riders, and let's send it out everywhere and command that it be in his own home. You just ensured that every woman hears about it. Great plan, king. So instead of preserving the quiet, he's now published his quarrel to everywhere. We see this as the opposite of what we should do. The Old Testament proverb 10:12, hatred stirs up strife, but love covereth all sins. In the New Testament, Peter tells us charity covers a multitude of sins. And you know, I think about the contrast between King Xerxes in the Persian Empire and our king when he calls his bride. Jesus doesn't call his bride for whatever it was that Xerxes had in mind. When Jesus calls his bride, he gives her honor. He doesn't call her to make a display. He doesn't punish her by banishment. He's the one that left heaven. He's the one that left. He's the one that suffered so that he could bring her into his presence. He didn't call her into the presence and then send her away. There's so many contrasts here. Jesus is the one that suffered so that we could come. Xerxes' name, Ahasuerus, when it is pronounced by a Hebrew in their original tongue, would be a homophone for their word headache. I'm telling you, the humor in this book is wonderful. King Headache, the teacup tyrant, and his 7 sleazy scumbags used the power of the entire Persian Empire to strike out at one woman. And when she refused, when she stood up to the power of the empire, what did they do? They manipulated the authority of law to threaten the peace of every home in the kingdom. A kingdom for which they were responsible for the peace. Why did they do it? Because they wanted to prove a point. A point, by the way, which they were incorrect about. A point which would very soon be irrelevant if they had just left it alone. A point which they wanted to prove because they were impulsive. This ancient book is so relevant to us today. Does it sound familiar? Can you say COVID-19? Do we see a tyrant using the authority of the law to affect every home in the region, in the realm? Sure. Are we divisive over it? Sure we are. And you know what? In about 3 months, we're going to have another, try not to get us kicked off YouTube, okay? I'm trying to be good. We're going to have another one of these that'll be good for the Omicron variant, which is totally irrelevant in about another 2 weeks. Yay! And you know what we're going to do? We're going to force everybody to take another one. And as we see court cases move forward, they're being struck down all over. And if you go back 8 months, 10 months, you see administrators say, we don't have the authority to do that. And if you go back about 4 months, well, we're pretty sure our authority lets us do this, but we don't care. We're doing it anyway. You just have to prove us wrong. Does it sound like the Empire Strikes Back? Does it sound like Esther chapter 1? Oh, okay, I'll get off that. How about gun control? Do we see the power of the empire being employed to make a statement? How about social justice? Nothing to see here. How about the Ukraine? How about energy policy? I can go on. In our study of Esther, like I said, that's only the first of many questions that will remain unresolved. This won't be the last time we see imperial stormtroopers with their boots on the neck of one person. In the next chapter, we'll see young girls that are conscripted for the pleasure of a king. We've never seen human trafficking, have we? We've never seen people in authority, princes dethroned because of involvement in human trafficking. I mean, I'm sure you've never heard of a guy named Jeffrey Epstein, right? Pretty soon we're going to meet a man that's the Secretary of State in this book. He's going to conspire to strike out against one single man. When that doesn't work, he'll plot against that one man to turn an entire ethnic group against another ethnic group. Does that sound familiar? I don't know. I'll try to woke up. We'll see one powerful man lead an entire people off the rails. Now, we'd like to think that that only applies to historical figures whose politics we disagree with. You know, Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot. But we've never seen that recently in our country either, have we? The riots last January should have been stopped. And they could have been stopped. You see, I can pick on both sides of the aisle. And we should. But some of that was done because one person tried to destroy another person for a political agenda. Who was it that paid for that Russian dossier? Which country was it that controlled the ballot box? I don't remember. We'll have more questions, and we won't have concrete answers. But what I can tell you we're going to see in this book is God using ordinary people to fulfill his promises because he is in control of history. It's a thing we call providence. And that's where I want you to be encouraged. That's where I think we need to be encouraged because it's the major theme of the author of the book of Esther. The miracle of Esther is that we don't have any miracles. As we look through this historical narrative, as we read through this, as we study this book, I want you to see us. Because we live in a time today when the political divide is getting greater. And we live in a time when it seems like we're being persecuted. It seems like God's not at work. It seems like everything's getting out of control. It seems like we as Christians might be destroyed. But I want you to know that God's working, and God is active, and God's in control, and he still rules over the armies of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or even question him. None can say unto him, what doest thou? God will accomplish his goals. He will keep his promises. God is in control of providence. He works through his people. But he works in what is so frequently unseen ways. He works in what is so often unremarkable ways. And that's what's so remarkable about it. As we go through this book, I challenge you and I encourage you to make notes. You write down all the number of coincidences that happen. Because none of them are coincidences. You write down the number of occurrences that are direct intervention of God. Because in this book, there are no miracles. And that's the miracle. Because everything that happens is just a coincidence at just the right time, with just the right people, in just the right place. Miracles of occurrence, miracles of timing, miracles of personnel, miracles of intervention, but none of them are miracles. And I want you to see as we study this book, that's exactly how God works in your life. Because if you're his child, we don't see things that we can't explain. We don't see things that are miraculous everyday events. But what we see is a sovereign God that keeps his promises through his people by working providence for our benefit and for his glory. And that's a miracle every day, being in his plan. That's the challenge of the book of Esther. So I encourage you to read ahead. Study ahead. Look for the humor. Look for the irony. And be amazed at how many things happen here that are not miracles at all, because they're all